afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Beyond Passwords, Two-Factor Authentication, Biometrics, and More, a webinar by LMG Security. My name is Natalie Bray, and I'm your moderator for today. Our presenters for the webinar today are Sherry Davidoff and Matt Duran. Matt Duran is the Director of Training and Research at LMG Security and a Senior Consultant with the organization. He is an instructor at the International Black Hat USA Conference, where he has taught classes on ransomware and data breaches. Matt has conducted cybersecurity seminars, tabletop exercises, and classes for thousands of attendees in all sectors, including banking, retail, healthcare, government, and more. A seasoned cybersecurity and IT professional, Matt specializes in ransomware response and research, as well as deployment of proactive cybersecurity solutions. Matt holds a bachelor's degree in computer science from the University of Montana, and his malware research has been featured on NBC Nightly News. Sherry Davidoff is the CEO of LMG Security and the author of Data Breaches, Crisis and Opportunity. As a recognized expert in cybersecurity, she has been called a, quote, security badass by the New York Times. Sherry is a GIAC certified forensic analyst and penetration tester and received her degree in computer science and electrical engineering from MIT. Her latest book, Ransomware and Cyber Extortion, will be published this fall. Sherry, I'm passing you control of the webinar.
Thank you. Matt, so excited that we're doing this talk today. Everybody, welcome back. We talk about multi-factor authentication in pretty much every webinar we do throughout the whole year. And usually we only have time for a couple minutes on it. Use multi-factor authentication. Don't use SMS-based authentication. Here's all the problems with passwords. We are so excited today to have the opportunity to really do a deep dive into this topic, especially because there has been so much change over the past year. And it's not like there's been huge changes in the technology, but there have been huge changes in attacker tactics and also the associated risks and the adoption of technologies that can truly provide strong authentication and a straightforward user experience. So with that, our roadmap for today, we're going to start by talking about how much we hate passwords and why we hate passwords. We'll keep it short. I've done whole therapy sessions on this. Then we'll dig into multi-factor authentication. It's not enough to just use MFA anymore. There's weak MFA, there's stronger MFA. So we'll talk about what we should use, what we should not use, and how to compensate for some of the weaknesses in things like one-time passwords and push notifications. We'll touch on password management. We got some questions on that topic. We'll discuss strong authentication options, how to make it easy and simple and straightforward for your users and your organization. And finally, we'll wrap up by talking about single sign-on, identity and access management, and the transition to a beautiful passwordless world. Let us begin by talking about how passwords stink. That is my technical analysis of this. That's really where we are. So one survey from Beyond Identity of users asked, what are the most annoying parts of the online account registration and login? And not surprising, the #1 answer was passwords that have specific requirements, numbers, letters, squirrel noises, you name it. I can't keep up with it. Another study from Hyper in the State of Passwordless Security report found that 63% of those surveyed could not access work-critical information because they forgot a password. I think many of us have been there. And finally, passwords cost us money. 39% of online shoppers said they often or always abandon their shopping cart due to an account recovery issue or forgetting a password. So really, passwords hurt our economy, you guys. For all those reasons, passwords stink. They also stink because they're not really good security. Stolen credentials are the #1 cause of data breaches, according to Verizon. Almost half of the cases that they analyzed involved stolen credentials. Not surprising when you consider the fact that there are 24 billion stolen credentials circulating the dark web. And that's only the credentials that we've actually found. That's almost certainly just a fraction of the total number that are out there. So hackers will steal those credentials and then use them to log into other things. The good news is that there are happy bunnies and rainbows and sunshine in our future. The future is passwordless. And Matt and I have been debating this for a long time because really it's been 20 years where we've been waiting for passwords to go away. But now we're seeing major organizations on board. And that's really what it takes to make a change, right, Matt? I mean, we were just talking yesterday about how when Microsoft's on board with something, it happens, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So we'll get back to this later today. We'll talk about the FIDO Alliance and why we are likely to see some real change in the next couple of years. All right, in the meantime, if you are still using passwords, it is absolutely critical to use a second factor as well. Multi-factor authentication is that belt and suspenders approach to identity verification. So if you recall, just to refresh, authentication means to verify someone's identity, and we can do that in one of three ways: with something you know, something you have, or something you are. Something you know being like a password, something you have might be a hardware token or your phone. Something you are is like your fingerprint, your face, retina reading, things like that. It's really important to deploy multi-factor authentication consistently. I can tell you in case after case that we see many times, their MFA has been deployed, but there's exceptions for the CEO or a vendor or IT staff. And those are the ones, frankly, that do get, that end up getting hacked. So make sure you deploy it consistently and you really limit those exceptions. So let's talk about the types of the different ways that we can implement multi-factor authentication, because again, some of those second forms attackers have really figured out how to bypass consistently. The big one is to use, to try to move away from anything that relies on the phone network. So Microsoft actually came out a couple of years ago and said it's time to hang up on phone transports for authentication. Any mechanism based on the public switch telephone networks, PSTNs, are the least secure of the MFA methods available today. So why is that? Well, the PSTN was not designed for security. Information is not encrypted as it goes through the public switch telephone network. Your text messages are not encrypted. It's basically like sending a postcard through that. And we've actually seen real life hacking cases where criminals exploit vulnerabilities in the cell network, and they intercept pins and use that to drain people's bank accounts. There's also lots of different attacks against your individual cell phone. SIM jacking is a really common method that attackers use to port your cell phone number to a different device. So they might contact your telecommunications provider and say, hello, we've got I am Matt and I've got a new device. Here's my social security number, which they probably bought on the dark web. And then they will have your number ported to their phone so that they can get all your sweet, juicy PIN numbers. There are other ways that this can happen as well. There have been cases where criminals actually pay off telecommunications employees to do the same thing. There was an investigative journalist that paid a hacker to sign up for an SMS enablement service, typically used for marketing, and then got copies of all the text messages for 16 bucks. So the hacker had to sign a form saying, I'm the user and I consent. But of course, hackers don't really care if they do that legitimately or if they lie. So SMS and phone calls, because they rely on that public switch telephone network, are really not strong methods of implementing a second factor of authentication. Even the FBI is getting on board. They came out with a public service announcement in February of this year, warning everyone that criminals are increasing their SIM swapping schemes and have been stealing millions and millions of dollars from people around the world. So we should really no longer be relying on text messages or even voice phone calls as our second factor. The other second factor that is weak and risky is emailed codes. Why? Because email accounts get hacked all the time. So you've probably seen this where either you don't have to enter any password at all, or a second form is sent as a PIN to your email account. The problem is, of course, that people get their email accounts hacked. You may not realize it. The criminals will try to break into other accounts, including your bank account, and they'll just get that PIN sent right over there to your email account, which they already have access to. On the screen here, you can see a recent screenshot from the dark web with Gmail accounts for sale, US Gmail accounts in this case. And on the left, you can see a message from Zoom with a code. This is designed to protect you. It's sent to your email. Again, the hackers can just copy that code, delete the email so that you never see it, and then get into your account. Oh, here's another one being sold on the same dark website, IT email accounts for sale as well. So sometimes they do target those specific roles. So what's better? Authenticator apps are better. We're actually going to go through a number of much stronger systems. Authenticator apps, we've been talking about these all year. They do encrypt any information in transit. They do mutual authentication. They're easy, they're inexpensive, but hackers have found ways to target them as well. And specifically, most of the time we're using authenticator apps, either you're getting a simple push notification like the one you see on the screen, approve this sign-on, approve or deny, or you have to copy a code and type it into an application, a one-time passcode. So let's talk about how criminals have figured out ways to consistently bypass those. So again, a one-time passcode is where users read a code or a PIN. It might be from an authenticator app. It could be from a text message or email. We've already talked about why those are out. It could also be from a hardware token. You might have like one of those tokens that pops up a new number once every minute. First of all, these are not fun for your users. Raise your hand if you love one-time passcodes. No, nobody's raising their hand. Raise your hand if you hate one-time passcodes. We'll get a little exercise here. Nice, right? Yeah, you and me both, Matt. It's annoying to have to type them in. And then of course, right when you go to type it in, it changes to the new code. I don't know about you, that always happens to me. One-time passwords are phishing prone, meaning that criminals have found ways to extract that from the users themselves. Lots of really effective ways. So often attackers will just text or call and request those codes. And you might think, how do people fall for that? But it's actually very sophisticated sometimes and coordinated, Matt. They'll often say that it's for verification purposes. So here's an example. It looks like a text message. And by the way, people will inherently trust text messages more than emails as well. So this is a text, looks like it's coming from Google Security. And it says, we have detected a rogue sign into your account credentials. In order to determine the legitimate login, we're going to send a verification code to your previously registered phone number from another Google support number. Please retype the sent verification code in response to this message, or your account will be permanently locked. And most people say, oh my God, it's from Google. I don't want my account to be locked. Then they get a Google verification code because the attackers are trying to log into their account and they trigger that. So poof, they get a Google verification code and they type it in. Another thing that happens is you might get a phishing email and visit a phishing website. You click a link. It looks just like the website you're trying to log into. It includes a spot for you to type in your code. Again, could be from an app, could be from a text message, whatever. Once you type it in, the criminals steal it and put it right in the real website at that moment before it has time to change to the next one. So for those reasons, one-time passwords are phishing prone. And hackers have really ramped up. Matt, tell us what you found.
Yeah, so this was an article that came out from Malwarebytes just recently, a couple of months back. And what they had identified was a series of man-in-the-middle phishing kits detected, or adversary-in-the-middle phishing kits detected. And this is kind of a step up from what we associate with a traditional phishing website. I mean, we're all familiar with what a lookalike website is, right? It's a website that just looks like it's the service you're trying to log into, and they're trying to steal your username and password. This is now stepped up to act as a pass-through. So the victim in this case is going to go to a website that looks exactly like the service they're trying to log into, Gmail, Microsoft, Amazon, whatever it might be, but the attacker is controlling that website. On the other side of this, the attacker is stealing the information that this individual is putting in and directly passing it through to the legitimate service, and this is going to include that two-factor authentication code. Using this method, that two-factor authentication essentially just becomes another part of the phish. And just like that, the account is compromised. The attacker can register their own device and they can have permanent access to the account at this point. So definitely something to be aware of as you're training your employees and other partners against phishing.
Yeah, guys, don't get too depressed though. I promise you, we will have like happy, fluffy bunnies and rainbows at the end of this presentation. We'll talk about a passwordless world. It'll be all good. Okay, there is a huge market for bots designed to steal 2FA codes on the dark web. One that you see on the right here, this is from Brian Krebs. It's called SMS Ranger, and it's a bot that just is designed to steal one-time passwords and SMS codes from your victims. It can do this in a number of ways. On the left, you can see an example of a voice call, a voice phishing call designed for this purpose. So the caller says, in order to secure your account, please enter the code we sent you to your mobile device now, the voice said. After entering a string of 6 digits, the voice said, thank you, your account has been secured and this request has been blocked. So again, in reality, the criminal has just stolen your code and logged into your account. So way to throw people off the scent. This is even more effective because caller ID spoofing is a thing. Again, the cell phone network, really telecommunications networks, were not designed for security, and so it's possible to make your number look like any number you want. On the right-hand side is another tool used by criminals called SMS Buster, and you're prompted, if you're a hacker, the hackers are prompted to enter the phone number they want to call, so the victim. Then they enter the phone number they want it to show, so it could be your mom, it could be Google's phone number. Then it says, let me know the service you want to impersonate. So in this case, they picked Scotiabank. Please let me know the first name of the victim, and in this case, they wrote doctor. Your request has been sent. Allow a few seconds. And the criminal's hoping they'll just get an SMS code back. All right, so let's go through a case study. Matt, tell us what you found.
Yeah, so this was a hack that happened pretty recently, and it was an organization called Twilio who suffered a pretty substantial breach of their internal information. Now, Twilio, if you're not familiar with it, is an inter-platform communication provider. So they automate things like SMS messaging, WhatsApp messaging, voice, video, and a lot more. In 2015, they also purchased a company called Authy, which handles SMS-based two-factor authentication codes, which is definitely something that we are, again, attempting to move away from. They detected an intrusion into their system on October 4th of 2022, and the attackers got pretty far in before anything was actually able to be done about it.
Matt, so I am shocked that a technology vendor could be hacked. I am shocked.
Right. I mean, this had to have been a very sophisticated and coordinated kind of cyber attack to be able to get in the door here, right?
Coordinated. No, but in all seriousness, we're seeing hackers target our technology supply chain, and you shouldn't be surprised by it anymore. What's unfortunate is that they were actually able to access people's codes. Okay, I'm not gonna scoop you too much.
Don't scoop me too much here. All right, so how this actually happened was a fairly straightforward phishing attack. A group called Octopus claimed responsibility for this and actually provided kind of a roadmap on how they were able to get in the door. This all started off as a SMS-based phishing attack, a very, very base bones, very, no frills kind of phishing attack. They were SMS messaging employees of the organization pretending to either work for Twilio or work for Okta or something like that. They used trusted names in these messages to make it look like they were legitimate. So things like Okta and Twilio were right there in the body. Once the victims in this case clicked on those links, it took them to a lookalike login site. And because there was no requirement for multi-factor authentication, for strong multi-factor authentication on these accounts, the attackers were able to harvest credentials. So what is the damage here? A company like Twilio handles a lot of other organizations. And all in all, there were about 163 individual Twilio customers impacted. Now, I know 163 doesn't seem like that big of a number when we're talking about a large-scale technology company like this, but we need to remember who those customers actually are. These aren't individual people who are using the service. These are large organizations. This is Okta and Cloudflare and a bunch of others that are using the service. So getting the one-time passwords and numbers associated with those, that's a big deal. Employee phone numbers and Authy MFA codes were also exposed in this attack. There were 1,900 Signal accounts that reported being completely taken over as a result of this. DoorDash resulted a huge slew of accounts being taken over, all because those one-time passwords that you would use for credentialed authentication were now available to an attacker along with the phone number associated with an account. So full account takeover is easy when you have that level of information.
All right, well, a few takeaways from this. Number one, remember, they were hacked in part because of SMS-based phishing attacks. And we already know that we need to disable weak authentication methods throughout our organizations, right? One-time passwords do not work anymore. So disable OTP, or really just authentication over email, phone calls, and SMS. And it's really important to check your fallback options. If you look, often people get hacked because you and me may use an authenticator app on a regular basis, but the criminals can go into the system and see, aha, text message is a fallback option. So if you get locked out of your account, you can receive a text message, and that's how the criminals are going to get it. So for all you IT administrators out there or leadership out there, make sure you disable weak authentication methods. The criminals are targeting these methods. Here's a screenshot of a case of LastPass, where normally the user uses an app, and again, you can see that fallback method here. Second is conduct user awareness training. So think before you click. And like we talked about last month, it's not enough to just have user awareness training. You need to make sure you're including the latest attacks, especially if they're really big and widespread. Things like SMS phishing, MFA fatigue attacks, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Make sure that your training is relevant and relates to the latest threats. And I would definitely recommend doing it on demand. Give us a ring or drop us a line if you need any help with this here at LMG. Okay, one question we've been getting is, how should I handle services or sites that don't offer multi-factor authentication or only offer SMS two-factor? Number one, that's a red flag, right? These forms of authentication are either should be out or they're on their way out. CISA has said that single factor authentication is on their list of bad practices. So the US government says single factor authentication is a bad practice. If it's only text message, you know, any MFA is better than no MFA, but you still want to be moving in the direction of strong multi-factor authentication. So first of all, consider if it's worth it for you. Assess your risk. What type of data is the vendor holding? What's their level of access? I would also contact your vendor. Is this something that's in their roadmap? Are they going to be rolling it out, say, in the next year? Can you wait? Also, a lot of times cloud providers and third-party vendors do offer stronger forms of authentication, but only for high security customers. So they may not advertise it widely. So find out if that's the case, because you may have access, you may be able to get access even though it's not advertised. And then if none of those are an option, consider alternatives. Again, you have to question what is their commitment to security and technology if they're not looking at offering truly strong two-factor authentication. It's not that hard to support these days. And if you're a technology company, again, look at supporting those for your customers and those in your community. All right, another very popular and widely used technology that's on its way out are simple push notifications. What? You're thinking? Yes, I know, it's so simple. And this is because of MFA fatigue attacks, also known as prompt bombing, where the criminals will send a high volume of push notifications to the victim's phone or to whatever device they're using. So one example of it is how Cisco got hacked. Cisco was hacked and a ransomware gang was advertising that they had 2.8 gigabytes of data from Cisco. And the way the criminals got in was using repeated MFA push notifications. Cisco actually wrote a whole blog post about it. It's always really interesting to see the analysis from a technology company themselves. They actually did a very good job. So along with the repeated MFA push notifications, they also did voice put phishing. So they posed as support, and that helps to ensure that the victim will actually approve the push notification when it comes through. We saw the same thing in the Uber hack, which we'll get to in just a moment. So using those repeated push notifications, the hackers obtained access. Once they got access, they enrolled new devices in MFA, and they were able to authenticate to Cisco's VPN. Boom. Done. So in the Uber hack, the recent Uber hack, the hackers, we actually get to hear it from the hackers themselves. So the hacker said, I was spamming the employee with push authentication for over an hour. Then I contacted him on WhatsApp and claimed to be from Uber IT, told him if he wants it to stop, he must accept it. And well, he accepted it and added my device. Guys, this happens all the time. We see case after case just like this. There was another message from the hackers just talking more generally about their tactics, where they said, sign in with a password, we'll issue MFA through a phone call or authentication app. However, no limit is placed on the amount of calls that can be made. Call the employee 100 times at 1 a.m. while he's trying to sleep, and he will more than likely accept it. So they've kind of given us a hint right here on one of the ways we can protect against this, which is place the limit on the amount of calls that can be made. Do not let somebody send 100 calls or push notifications to a victim's phone. And then hopefully they won't be a victim at all. All right, this has become such a problem that the US government came out early this year, issued a memorandum for all the heads of departments and agencies, and said that agencies must require users to use a phishing resistant method to access agency hosted accounts. For routine self-service access by agency staff, contractors, and partners, agencies actually need to discontinue support for authentication methods that fail to resist phishing. And the methods that they use that are on the chopping blocks are SMS or voice calls, one-time codes, and push notifications. Not an option within the next couple of years. They're going to be cut off. So we should all be planning, again, and moving that direction. And they're also required to offer phishing-resistant methods as well to the public. So this is really a big trend that we're about to see. All right, in the meantime, if your users are using one-time passwords, if they are using simple notifications, there are a few things you can do to protect your organization today. One of them is to take advantage of number matching, which is offered by Microsoft, it's offered by Duo, it's offered by other authentication organizations. So on the screen, you will see a number, in this case, it's 83 when you go to log in. And then the user will be prompted not just to hit yes, but to enter the number that is there on the screen. Now, can this still be phished? Yes. Is it harder? Yes. And the criminals would need to adapt their tools. And frankly, we see criminals going for the low-hanging fruit. So this is a stopgap measure that you can use right now. Also, you want to configure MFA and account lockout. Just limit the number of MFA prompts. Make it so they can't get bombed with 100 different notifications. And then Matt, I know you've talked a lot about the need for contextual awareness, adaptive MFA. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so in a lot of cases, these are going to be conditional access policies that are going to be associated with a specific user's account. And when we say conditional access policies, they're basically policies that in a lot of cases, especially when we're talking about something like Azure or Office 365, look at how that user normally accesses that content. So what device are they logging in from? When do they normally log in? Where do they log in from? And if we configure access policies to look for those high-risk attempts, if any of those doesn't line up with normal activity, if they're signing in after hours, if they're signing in with a strange device or something like that, it can trigger additional challenges to increase the security of the account. The nice part about this too is that if we configure these properly, if the user is logging in using all of their standard methods, we can actually greatly reduce the visibility of that multi-factor or secure sign-in system that they're using, and that just makes for a much better user experience all the way around.
Thanks, Matt. Let's take a little detour for a second, or really just go back in time and talk a little bit about the password problem. Speaking of putting band-aids on things, many of us are still using passwords, and there are ways that we can at least make this a more secure factor that we use. So the problem with passwords, and Matt, I love this image that you found from Microsoft. If you're creating a new password and it is secure enough, you won't be able to remember it. And if you create a new password and it's something you can remember, it is not secure enough. Like, that's really the catch-22 of passwords there in a nutshell. So I love this diagram. Okay, so let's talk about how criminals steal passwords, because then we'll understand how we can better secure them. Recall from our previous webinars that criminals steal passwords typically in 3 ways. Number 1, from your computer. So they infect your computer. They will automatically scrape your files looking for passwords. So don't store your passwords in files on your computer. Yes, I am talking to you. After this webinar, delete that file, flush it down the toilet, use a proper password manager. We'll get to that in a second. They also steal your password using phishing attacks. So people click a link, they're taken to a website that looks legitimate, they type in their password, sometimes their one-time passcode also, and poof, the criminals will use that to log into the real thing. And then finally, hacked websites. They steal passwords from websites that are hacked. You might not know about it for months or years. You have no way to protect yourself. And LinkedIn's a really great example where even today, we see criminals using passcodes from the LinkedIn data breach years ago and logging into other websites because people still are reusing those same passwords, right? You know it. You have a password you're still using that was out there 5 years ago. So remember, criminals engage in credential stuffing. So they steal your passwords and they will stuff it into every single website that they can. Personal sites, work sites, file sharing sites, tax sites, banking sites, your email, you name it. And so, oh, this is a great quote from Microsoft. Hackers don't break in, they log in. So it's very important to choose a strong password, but the meaning of strong password has changed. Strong passwords are no longer complex passwords. And it's not just me saying that, it is our national government saying that. NIST came out in 863 and said, you know what, everybody, we're done. You do not have to require people to pick complicated passwords, because complicated passwords make them very difficult to remember. And that means people will reuse them. There's a lot of expense in changing them. So we're done. No more super complicated passwords. I mean, if you can do it, great, but it's not a requirement. Second, You do not need to change your password regularly. This whole thing where we have to change our password every 90 days, and that means we have to change September to December or things like that, you don't have to do that anymore. So again, if you feel like you're capable of it, it's not going to hurt. It means if someone's stolen your password, then it won't be useful to them anymore, but not a requirement. What is a requirement, at least based on current attacks, is number one, you need to have a unique password. That's really important because you won't know when a password is stolen. And if you use that other places, the criminals will try that. So a strong password is a unique password, and a strong password is a long password. Why do we still care about the length of passwords? It's because of how password cracking works. If an encrypted database of passwords is stolen, let's say from a cloud provider, criminals will go through and try to reverse engineer what the original password was if they only have those encrypted passwords. And that's actually really hard to do if the password is very long. The longer it is, the harder it is for them to crack that encryption. So you want your passwords to be unique, you still want them to be really, really long and obviously hard to guess. If it's your first and last name, it might be really long, but someone's probably going to guess it. Okay, so I know it probably gives everybody heartburn to hear I have to have a unique password for every single thing that I do, and you are totally normal. The human brain is not designed for this purpose. So instead, we can use computers to be our brain for us. Get a password manager. They are inexpensive, if not free in some cases. Some of the popular ones are Dashlane, LastPass, 1Password, and you can generate passwords in there and then use these password managers to store them. Now, if you're going to put all your eggs in one basket, make sure that you secure that basket, right? So use multi-factor authentication for the login, and just make sure that you're properly configuring any password vaults that you use, particularly in an enterprise environment, because criminals are targeting them. Matt, do you want to tell us a little bit about password sharing?
Yeah, so one of the biggest kind of banes of our existence in information security, or at least in my previous days as a system administrator, was the sharing of passwords between services. And I know we would all like to think that everyone in our organization is going to have a unique username and password for every service or system that we're using. Unfortunately, we know that's probably not the case. So if there is a need to share passwords, you can utilize a password manager like Dashlane, which you see on the screen in front of you here, for that purpose. And this is a really nice way to go about this. You can share passwords anonymously, meaning when you share a password to a user, you don't actually have to tell them what the password is. The Dashlane app will autofill that for them on a web page. They simply get access to that portion of the account. The other really nice part about this is if there is a need to revoke the access to those passwords, to remove the ability for someone to actually utilize those systems, they can be done with just a couple of clicks inside the dashboard. So a much better solution than writing things down on a Post-it note or sending them through Slack or sending them through Teams or something along those lines. Having this kind of a technology solution for this purpose means our overall account security, especially for these shared accounts, is greatly increased. So definitely something we recommend.
Thanks, Matt. Okay, so the bottom line is that if you use passwords, they're convenient according to this chart, but low security. I actually don't even think passwords are that convenient. They're definitely low security, so we want to try to move away from them. If you use passwords plus two-factor authentication, it is inconvenient and a higher method of security, but we want our users to be happy and we want to be happy ourselves. So really where we're going is to this world of password-less authentication. Yes, that is like the nirvana we're all hoping to achieve. And the good news is it is achievable. So we're going to take this next section to talk about how we achieve this and really what the future of authentication looks like. So how do we use strong authentication, or how do we implement strong authentication? Well, there's some effective tools we can use to do that today, and I would break them into three categories: biometrics, hardware tokens, and then passkeys. So let's start off by digging into biometrics, like breath scan recognition. This image is amazing, by the way, breath scan recognition. Okay.
Did I ever end up actually telling you the story behind that?
No.
Okay, so in June of this year, this is actually a fairly recent development. In June of this year, the Kyushu University in Japan went through a massive study where they looked to see if they could analyze and identify someone based on their breath alone. They found a 16-point system that can identify very specific characteristics about your body chemistry that can identify an individual, in their testing anyway, about 97% of the time. Now, that is still, as far as authentication goes, a low amount, but for an infant technology that is basically just based on you breathing out, that is an amazing level of success. So definitely something
like,
we'll probably
shoot, I
see.
had Indian food and I can't get into my computer.
Oh, that'll be great.
Okay, sorry. Go for it. Tell us about the rest of this.
All right, so the rest of the biometric options that we're looking at are really intended to fulfill that something you are section of the authentication triad. And really what we're looking at doing is removing that knowledge-based part of it. There's a lot of downsides to knowledge-based authentication. I think we've covered those pretty well up to this point. But if we're using something like facial recognition, fingerprint recognition, retinal scans, or something like that, we can positively identify someone about 99.999% of the time as that individual. There are also things like liveness detectors to avoid things like picture spoofing or fingerprint spoofing. There's a lot that can go into this. The big one that we're really seeing in use in a lot of devices anymore, though, is facial recognition scanning. And you'll see this pop up on things like mobile devices, on laptops, and there's a good reason for this. We all have very high definition cameras on a lot of our devices now, and so using that kind of biometric authentication and that kind of facial recognition avenue to get in is a great way to go about it. Yeah, Sherry, you have a question.
How do they deal with the beard issue?
How do we deal with the beard issue? That's a great question. There are also some limitations when we're talking about masks that we'll throw in there a little bit too, because there are COVID considerations to take into account. But really what they're looking at is about the top half of your face. They're looking at the spread of your cheekbones, the crest of your nose, the distance between your eyes, your eyebrows, your forehead crown, and a lot of other. Based on these data points, we can create a very, very intricate and detailed, unique map of an individual's face, and this is how we rely on that system. Windows Hello for Business is an excellent example of this. It's embedded on pretty much every new Windows laptop that's out there. Whether or not you choose to use it is up to you. I highly recommend that you do so. But it is, again, one of those things we will definitely see more of moving forward. Touch ID is another one that we like to talk about a lot. So I threw up an article here, and I know this is an old story, but I have to throw it in because it's just too good. So Touch ID, which most of us are probably familiar with, is the use of a fingerprint to authenticate against a device. And fingerprints are a very, very accurate way of doing that. The risk here is that this is susceptible to someone getting a hold of your phone and your hand at the same time, like if you're sleeping. In this, in the story we have up on the screen here, we have a child who was smart enough to use his mother's fingerprint to unlock her phone and order a bunch of different Pokemon gifts. We see the same thing happen off of Amazon. We see from eBay, and I get it; those are kind of comical examples. But there is a real security concern here. If there is someone who is able to get access to you and your device, they can use your thumbprint now to biometrically authenticate against it. So this is where we run into those high-risk authentication challenges.
Yeah, and Matt, I know that was an issue with facial recognition as well. And so as a result, Apple actually looks to make sure your eyes are open, and other systems do as well. But I don't know if you remember when we were at Black Hat a couple years ago, some researchers found that they could put glasses on a sleeping person with fake pupils in the middle, and it would fool Apple devices into thinking that your eyes were open and then unlock your phone. So the devil's really in the details when it comes to all of these biometrics.
Yep. Palm print. Okay, this one's really cool. So palm print reading is a new kind of technology that Amazon is rolling out right now. It's called Amazon One. And again, it uses multiple individual data points on your palm specifically to identify you. The concern with this one specifically is that it's not necessarily being used as a secure method of authenticating. It's being used as a method to authorize payment in most cases. This is being rolled out in grocery stores mostly in California at this point. Whole Foods is kind of running a pilot program for this. But it means that you can go through, you can do your grocery shopping, and then when you check out to pay, you literally just have to wave your hand over a sensor and you are out the door. Again, privacy concerns aside, this is a very, very accurate way of identifying exactly who you are. And palm print biometric authentication is incredibly hard to spoof, more so than facial recognition. So definitely something that is a very ingenuitive new way of going about this type of authentication.
You sound like you have some concerns about biometrics and privacy, Matt.
Yes, biometric data and privacy has become the topic of conversation in a few different places, and there's a good reason for that. Your biometrics, especially your facial features, are actually out there all over the place, or at least in a lot of people's cases. Most of this comes in the form of social media. There was a company called Clearview AI that was actually scraping all of those individual pictures from Twitter, from Facebook, from Instagram, from a lot of other places, and they were creating this massive facial recognition database that they were then attempting to sell out to law enforcement, private security organizations, foreign governments, and a lot of other places. The problem, of course, is that they had no right to actually take those pictures. They were doing this outside of the authorization and outside of the user agreements of these services. And so there was actually just a large-scale lawsuit against Clearview limiting what they're actually able to do with these. And they had to sign an agreement that said 5 years would go by before they can actually harvest any more biometric recognition data. Whether or not they actually do that is kind of up in the air. We'll see. There was also a record-breaking settlement that we saw coming out of the state of Illinois. And Illinois, as an example, is at this point in time the only state inside of the United States that actually has a biometric privacy law on the books in their state. Other states have these in the works. They're moving up to actually move into active law, but right now Illinois seems to be about the only one that's watching it. Facebook was caught harvesting biometric data for use in their face tag feature inside of the Facebook application itself, and they were doing this in the face of this law protecting biometric privacy in Illinois. So basically, every Facebook user in Illinois got a check for about $400 to the tune of, again, about $650 million by the time it was done. It's nice to see there are some very kind of strong regulations going into place to protect your biometric security, but we can see ways that this can be misused pretty easily.
Well, the good news is we could all make a lot of money off of it in settlements.
True enough.
Woohoo! All right, what is making all of this real? One of the reasons we're seeing strong authentication technology more widely deployed is because of a group called the FIDO Alliance. The FIDO Alliance was founded in 2012, and they do multiple things. One, they develop technical specifications for strong authentication. So two of their flagship specifications are, number one, for passwordless authentication, they have UAF, the Universal Authentication Framework. And then for multi-factor authentication, they have Universal Second Factor, or U2F. They have a specification on that. As a little side note, I think it's really interesting that the term two-factor authentication really is on its way out. You know, like that is so like 3 years ago. Nowadays, MFA multi-factor is the way to go because we often see people using more than 2 factors. 3 factors is absolutely not unheard of these days. You might have a password and biometrics and something else, who knows? So multi-factor is the new modern term. The FIDO Alliance also runs certification programs to help educate and train and make sure that people know what they're doing when it comes to implementing these standards. And they will also, once a specification is pretty mature, they will submit those specifications to standard bodies in the hopes of getting more widespread adoption. And this is not just a few random people. This is supported by many, many major organizations. So today, the FIDO Alliance members include organizations like Amazon, American Express, Apple, Google, Intel, Lenovo, LastPass, Meta, Microsoft, CVS, RSA, Samsung, Visa, Chase, 1Password, Clear, Discover, like the list goes on and on. There's eBay, Fujitsu, Ping Identity, Red Hat, Okta, different banks, Sony, Twitter, Verizon, like holy cow. And then you have government entities as well. So you can see the NIST in the US, you have NIST, you have government agencies from other countries as well. So again, very, very widely supported organization. FIDO has 8 privacy principles, and I'll just point a few out, but you may want to check out their website, fidoalliance.org, because again, this is going to become more and more relevant over the next few years. Their number 1 principle is to require explicit informed user consent for any operation using personal data. So you know what you're actually agreeing to. Provide clear context to the user for any FIDO operations. Limit collection of personal data to FIDO related purposes. So they have those built-in privacy protections. A couple more to point out that biometric data must never leave the user's personal computing environment. Again, for protecting people, that's really key. And allow users to easily view and manage their FIDO authenticators so that you have control. So let's talk a little bit about how FIDO works. Matt, do you want to walk us through registration today, and I'll take us through the login process? We'll flip it.
Yeah, that sounds great. So when we register a device for use in a FIDO compliant kind of system, a couple of things need to happen. So first, the user is going to be prompted to actually choose an available FIDO authenticator, and this can come in a few different formats. We're talking about things like hardware security keys, PIN codes on an approved device, biometric authentication using a thumbprint. I mean, there's a bunch of different ways we can go about this. The user unlocks this identifier or this authenticator using a fingerprint reader or something else, and that's going to create a public-private key pair that can be used for secure authentication. And the use of this public-private key is a great step forward when we're talking about, well, authentication, but a lot of other security technologies in general. We won't get into that today, but it's something that we definitely want to see a lot more of. Now, when the user's device creates this now sends a public key out for use in the actual authentication process. And Sherry will talk about this when we get to the login section, but this public-private key pair, this level of encryption being used between these systems, is what actually makes this a secure method of authenticating an individual user.
Yep, so when you actually go to log in, your device, whatever you happen to be using, reaches out to the site. You approve the use of your public-private key for login, and then in some form or fashion, you will actually unlock that public-private key pair. So if you remember from our webinar on how encryption works, you don't ever have to send any sensitive data over the internet, right? It's not like sending a password that somebody could intercept. Instead, what one key locks, the other key unlocks, and what one key signs, the other key can verify. So the site will typically send you a challenge, and you will do some math with your private key, send the result out to the site. They will verify the result using your public key. So only you have the private key that could have taken that action, but really that site or anybody with a copy of the public key can verify that it was your device that took that action. And depending on the implementation, you can unlock access to that key in many different ways. For example, you could do that with biometrics. So again, check out our webinar on how encryption works if you want more information. Public key cryptography is one of our favorite topics, one of the most powerful tools in cybersecurity. So it's really worth taking the time to understand it. So let's see it in action. If you're going for a password experience like using UAF standards, there's an online authentication request. You can unlock that key using biometrics. So let's say using your fingerprint, for example. It will cryptographically authenticate you on the back end under the hood, and poof, success. There is no password involved, and this is a very strong form of authentication. This is definitely more secure than just using a password at all. So really easy for the user, not too hard to set up. You can also do passwordless using, or you can also implement two-factor authentication with hardware tokens as well. So I want to move into security using hardware tokens because there's a number of different things we can do with this. So hardware security can support things like biometrics. So we see a lot of these hardware tokens that have fingerprint readers. We'll come back to this in a second. You can plug it into your computer via USB. You can use NFC or Bluetooth in some cases. These are helpful in environments either where users don't want to use their personal phones for authentication, or maybe they can't carry a phone into that environment, or maybe it's just not convenient to use a phone. So here are some examples. Matt, I don't know if you want to kind of walk through the landscape of what you found researching these Swiss Army knives of hardware of security.
Yeah, there's some great options out there if you're looking at hardware keys for your environment, and depending on how secure you want to get and how into the weeds of your actual organizational security you want to go, there are some really great options out there. YubiKey is kind of the gold standard when it comes to these hardware authentication tokens. We see these all over the place. They're very popular, very reliable, and they come in a lot of formats. There are available options for NFC. There are available options for biometric authentication that have live detection available, and a lot more. We also see things like the Titan key, which is being developed in cooperation with Google. We see a lot of other third-party security applications that are making very, very robust offerings. And realistically, you're looking at, depending on where you want to go with these, starting at about $30 per key if you want to order these things in for your overall environment. But the benefit you get to your security by using a hardware key is way beyond that $30. Absolutely something that you should look at implementing into your cybersecurity budgeting and planning moving forward. One of the big reasons why we love these so much is because of how useful they can actually be. So you remember earlier we talked about the Twilio attack and how attackers were able to get in based on a very simple SMS phishing style attack. Cloudflare as an organization was actually hit at the same time by the same group that was attempting to hack Twilio. And and this is a release from Cloudflare, while individual employees did fall for the phishing messages, we were able to thwart the attack through a use of our Cloudflare One products, a physical security key issued to every employee that is required to access all applications. The only difference between these two was the use of that hardware security key. And because of that security key, the attackers were not able to actually get into the network and access any of the internal information. So just right there, two organizations side by side, we can see how useful something like this can be.
Want to tell us about passkeys, Matt?
Sure, I'll talk about passkeys. I love passkeys. So one of the things that we've seen is an increased kind of reliance on hardware passkeys, and a lot of times these can be integrated directly into something like a mobile device. Really handy, really convenient. Passkey, in its general definition, we have it right here on the screen for you. It's a digital credential tied to a user account for a website or application, and it allows the user to authenticate without having to enter any of that information. No username, no password, or any additional authentication factor. The something you have and something you are is right there in your hand. You have a signed device and you have biometric authentication on that device, and using those two in concert with each other means this is a completely seamless passwordless experience. This is where we want to go, or at least in a lot of cases. So an absolutely exciting technology, especially if you're a geek like me, and something I know that we're going to see a lot more of.
Great. We do have a little correction on biometric laws, and we are not lawyers, but there are laws in 3 states on biometrics: Illinois, Washington, and Texas. However, Matt, you're correct in that only one of them, Illinois, gives individuals a private right of action.
Cool.
There are laws in those 3 different states. Okay, so as we move towards strong authentication and hopefully more convenient authentication, what do we need to have in place to support this?
I think one of the biggest things that you need to be leveraging is an identity and access management solution, an IAM solution. And we hear people talk about this all the time. The nice part is you're probably already using something like that. So Azure Active Directory, AWS, Manage Engine, something like that can be used for this purpose. We're looking for a system that can create, manage, and delete identities in kind of a streamlined process. We also want to be able to control access permissions, and we can then use this system to authenticate against a bunch of other different systems out there. If we integrate with a third-party app like Duo, for example, we can utilize this as a single sign-on provider. And single sign-on is something that we absolutely recommend as an addition to your security protocols moving forward. Not just for the fact that it makes IT work a lot easier, which we'll talk about here in a second, but your users will like it more. Now, when we're talking about single sign-on, again, we're talking about leveraging a centralized identity provider to authenticate us against a bunch of different applications that we use. When I say this, I'm not talking about password reuse. I want to be very clear about that. This is not reusing the same password for every individual site. All of these services have their own strong, unique passwords, but the user doesn't actually have to know what they are in most cases. All they have to do is log on to something like a single sign-on portal where they will be challenged. They will use a multi-factor authentication device to access, and then they can have access to all those apps just right there at their fingerprints. What we're really doing too is transitioning our basically our actions as users to get away from the habit of entering usernames and passwords. That's going to be important moving forward, and this is a great first step for that. So why would you want to use something like single sign-on inside your organization? Well, first off, it greatly improves your user experience. As we move into more sophisticated technologies for security, oftentimes we get pushback because they're kind of a pain to use. Single sign-on is a great way to get around that. We also reduce the potential for password reuse because, as I mentioned, in most cases, the user doesn't ever have to enter or even know the password for these websites. This can all be handled on the back end. We can integrate with role-based access control policies, and this also lowers IT costs for you because it simplifies user provisioning, deprovisioning. We don't have to worry about password resets and a lot of other really nice benefits here. So the other thing that we really want to look at here is the integration of an enterprise authentication suite. And I've mentioned Duo a couple of times. They're absolutely not the only ones out there, but they are a great example. So we'll go ahead and talk about them. This can be used with a wide variety of authentication methods, and pretty much anything that uses SAML or standardized NTLM authentication can integrate with these systems. Really great to have around. I don't want to go too deep in the weeds on that one, but we can also implement adaptive access policies, and that's huge. These are these conditional policies that we were talking about earlier. If there are additional challenges needed, if there's account lockouts that are needed, then we can prefab those into our overall configuration, and then we can integrate directly with our identity management solution for a single sign-on purpose or for any other kind of verification that we need. So these things working in tandem create a very robust security environment for you.
Great. I love this chart that you pulled from Microsoft about how to transition to a passwordless future. Microsoft really lays it out very nicely. So we start off where that little octopus is today, where we're just mad about passwords. And then we need to develop password replacement offerings. So you have to have your alternative in place before you can transition. And then once you've done that, the idea is to reduce basically the interactions that users have involving passwords. Matt, I know when we were chatting about it yesterday, it was really all about implementing things like single sign-on, getting your users out of the habit of typing in passwords at all, right?
Right.
And then the next step is to transition into that passwordless deployment. And finally, once you have everybody over and everything is humming along, then you can eliminate passwords from the identity directory and hop into a beautiful new passwordless future. So that's how we get there. I think those 4 steps are really key. So with that, we've really covered a lot of ground today. Here's our top 10 authentication tips. Use multi-factor authentication. Don't use weak authentication. It is time, guys. We've got to leave these behind. Text message, phone, email, they are out. Federal government is taking a strong stance on it. Microsoft is taking a strong stance on it. We're going to be done soon. If you have to use one-time passwords, make sure you conduct user awareness training. If you have to use simple push notifications, again, these are on their way out, but for now, configure something like number matching that requires some context, and then configure account lockouts. That's a pretty simple way to really foil the MFA bombing attacks. If you do need to use passwords, which many of us do, choose strong passwords. Leverage a password manager. Ideally, we're moving to a future where we're using strong authentication tools, biometrics, hardware tokens, passkeys. To get there, we need to deploy single sign-on, we need to leverage identity and access management, and then an enterprise authentication suite. So it's more than just Google Authenticator when you're in a corporate or an enterprise environment. You really need to be able to deploy different requirements for different types of devices, for example. So if you have personal devices, you might require a different type of authentication than company-owned devices. And then finally, we can transition to that beautiful passwordless future. So with that, thank you so much for joining us today. You can reach out to us at training@lmgsecurity.com or find us on LinkedIn. And Natalie, I'll turn it back over to you to see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Sherry and Matt, so much for that presentation. Learned a lot. Definitely will be taking note and letting my friends and family know of those tips from today. Let's start with some questions that came from our audience. The first one is passkey secure again as it is on a mobile device?
I wonder if they mean are passkeys secure on a phone as they are on a mobile device? Yeah, Matt, have you done any analysis of that?
Yeah, so looking at the passkey security, and the answer is yes. We've done some looking at on this one. So passkey security is really based around the security of the device that you're using. So if you have a mobile device like a modern iPhone or a modern Android device that does support secure biometric authentication, that's a very secure method to use as a passkey. There are other types of passkeys you can use that are standalone devices, which we don't see as often, and we've actually seen quite a few of those able to be cloned. So something that we would be a little bit worried about. But for the most part, passkey security is a very secure method of moving to that passwordless kind of dream that we're all hoping for here.
Great, thank you, Matt, for answering that question. Next one, how do I keep my password manager from getting compromised?
Great question. So there's lots of different kinds of password managers. We've also seen when you're using a password vault in an enterprise, very similar, we also see that criminals are now targeting them. They're targeting your password vaults, they're targeting your backups, they're targeting your security systems because they know that once they get them, they have the keys to the kingdom. So number one, you need to use multi-factor authentication for logging into your password vault. Strong authentication is critical. When IHG got hacked recently, and we went through this last month in the budget webinar, IHG got hacked, the criminals went after the password vault and were able to get in because the access was only using a simple password, and it was actually a password that would have been easily guessable, but they found it in a text file. So those details really matter. Make sure you are not relying on passwords and that you are using strong authentication. You also need to make sure that your password systems, your password storage systems are not vulnerable. So make sure you update to the latest version, you apply any security patches, things like that. Matt, anything you want to add?
Nope, you hit everything I would have said.
Great.
Great, thank you. So you spoke a little bit about FIDO, and somebody is asking, is Microsoft the only FIDO holdout?
Oh, no, Microsoft uses FIDO already. Windows Hello is completely based on FIDO compliance standards. We're actually doing some testing on it right now, and it actually works really, really well. So really excited to move forward with that project.
Yeah, when Microsoft supports things, they tend to be moved forward. So we're really happy that Microsoft is like 100% on board with the FIDO standards.
Yep.
Great. Yeah, that's really cool. I'm looking forward to learning more about that in future webinars. That answers all of our questions for today. So if anyone has any other questions or comments, feel free to reach out to us using our contact info on the screen. Thank you, Sherry and Matt, for today's presentation. Once again, this is Natalie with LMG Security. We would like to thank everyone who attended today's session. Thank you so much and have a very happy Thursday.
Thank you so much, everyone. Again, this is Sherry Davidoff, CEO of LMG Security.
And I'm Matt Duran, Director of Training and Incident Response for LMG Security. If you have any questions, please reach out at any time. We would love to hear from you. You can reach us at info@lmgsecurity.com, find us on LinkedIn, and follow us on Twitter. Thanks again for joining, and we'll see you next time.